The Man Who Loved His Sisters, The Secret That Rotted in Appalachian Town. This is not just a title. This is the truth that destroyed generations in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where blood became poison and family became curse. Spring 1947, Harlan County, Kentucky. Deep in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, where fog clings to the hollers like a funeral shroud and the nearest neighbor might be 3 miles through dense forest, there existed a family that time forgot. The Crowder family, 23 souls living on 80 acres of isolated mountain land, connected to the outside world by a single dirt road that became impassable 6 months of the year. The patriarch was Silas Crowder, born in 1895. A coal miner who lost his left hand in a shaft collapse in 1923. After the accident, he retreated with his wife Margaret to the family homestead, a collection of rough-hewn cabins clustered around a main house that his grandfather had built in 1867. Silas and Margaret had 9 children between 1918 and 1935. The eldest was Thomas, born January 1918. Then came the daughters, Mary in 1920, Elizabeth in 1922, Sarah in 1924. And Ruth in 1926. Thomas Crowder was different from the beginning. Neighbors who occasionally crossed paths with the family at the general store in Lynch, Kentucky, 8 miles away, remembered him as unnaturally attached to his sisters. By 1935, when Thomas was 17, the whispers had already started. Old Mrs. F. Pauline Henderson, who ran the store, recalled in her journal, discovered decades later that Thomas would stand too close to his sisters, would touch their hair with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The Crowder property sat in a natural bowl surrounded by steep ridges covered in oak, pine, and rhododendron so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. The main house was a 2-story structure with a sagging porch and windows covered with oilcloth instead of glass. Behind it stood 3 smaller cabins, a barn that leaned dangerously to one side, and a root cellar dug into the hillside. The creek that provided their water ran brown with iron deposits, and in winter, ice formed in sheets that reflected the skeletal trees above. By 1940, something had fundamentally changed in the Crowder household. Thomas, now 22, had not left the property in over 3 years. His sisters, Mary, Elizabeth, and Sarah, all of marrying age, remained at home, isolated from the young men in nearby communities. Silas and Margaret had grown silent, their faces carved with lines too deep for their ages, their eyes holding secrets that turned their hair white. The youngest children, 4 boys born between 1928 and 1935, were different. James, born in 1928, had a twisted spine that forced him to walk bent forward. Daniel, born in 1930, possessed eyes that pointed in different directions and hands with 6 fingers each. The 2 youngest, Robert and William, seemed normal at first glance, but locals who saw them on rare trips to town noted they moved strangely, their gaits uneven, their speech slurred and difficult to understand. In April 1942, Mary Crowder, then 22 years old, gave birth to a daughter in the main house. No doctor attended. No midwife was called. The birth was whispered about weeks later when Silas appeared at the store to purchase extra supplies, his face gray as ash. The baby, it was said, had something wrong with her head. It was too large, misshapen, with skin so thin you could see the veins beneath, like purple rivers on a map of hell. The child died before summer. They buried her on the property in a family cemetery that contained 17 graves, many of them tiny, many of them without names, just rough wooden crosses that rotted in the mountain rain. Then in October 1943, Elizabeth, age 21, had a son. Again, no outside help. Again, something was catastrophically wrong. The baby boy was born with his internal organs partially outside his body, a condition that even the most experienced physicians of the era could do nothing to correct. He lived for 3 hours, mewling weakly, before death claimed him. Elizabeth never spoke again. She became a ghost in the house, moving from room to room, her eyes vacant, her hands constantly wringing an invisible cloth. By 1945, the pattern was undeniable to those few who had glimpses of the Crowder family. Sarah, now 21, was visibly expecting a child, but the father was never mentioned. No young man from the area had courted her. No stranger had been seen visiting the property. The pregnancy simply existed like a tumor growing in darkness. Ruth, the youngest daughter at 19, had developed a pronounced tremor in her hands and a facial twitch that made her left eye close involuntarily every few seconds. She had the look of someone decades older, her teeth already falling out, her hair thin and lifeless. The winter of 1946-1947 was brutal in Harlan County. Snow fell in November and didn't melt until March. The Crowders were completely cut off, their road impassable even by horse. When spring finally broke and the postman, Earl Gibson, made his first delivery up the mountain in late March 1947, he found a scene that would haunt him until his death in 1978. The main house smelled of sickness and rot. Through the grimy windows he could see movement, but when he knocked, no one answered for a full 10 minutes. Finally, Thomas Crowder appeared at the door. He was 29 years old but looked 50. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken deep in their sockets, his skin the color of spoiled milk. Behind him, Gibson could see two small children, perhaps 2 and 3 years old, both with heads too large for their bodies, both with eyes that didn't quite focus, both making sounds that weren't quite human. Gibson left quickly, his stomach churning. He said nothing to anyone for 3 days, but the images pursued him. Finally, he spoke to Sheriff Delbert Rayburn, a hard man who had served in World War I and thought he had seen everything darkness could produce. Confirase gea inscrito nes canal porcas verdades q revelamos aqui snow as q ninguam mais temcore gem demostra. Historias q vio phaser voca questioner tudos sobra familia sanga eos segredos q apadrosem por girax. Sheriff Rayburn drove up to the Crowder property on April 14, 1947, accompanied by Deputy Frank Morrison and Dr. Harold Weiss, the county's only physician. The road was barely navigable, more of a muddy track carved between trees than an actual path. It took them 90 minutes to cover 8 miles. What they found exceeded their darkest imaginings. The compound, for that was the only word that fit, consisted of the main house and the 3 cabins, all in states of advanced decay. Trash and refuse littered the yard, chickens pecked at rotting food scraps, and 3 mangy dogs barked weakly at their approach, too malnourished to pose any real threat. The smell hit them 30 feet from the main house, a combination of unwashed bodies, human waste, and something sweet and rotten that made Dr. Weiss cover his mouth with a handkerchief. Silas Crowder met them at the door, his one remaining hand gripping a walking stick. He was only 52 but looked ancient, his face collapsed around missing teeth, his body bent and twisted. He said nothing, simply stepped aside to let them enter. The interior was dim, lit only by small windows and a fire that smoldered in a stone fireplace, filling the room with smoke that had nowhere to go. The furniture was rough and broken, the floor covered with layers of grime. In one corner, 3 children sat huddled together, ages appearing to range from 2 to perhaps 5 years old. All 3 had severe abnormalities. One child, a girl, had a face that seemed to slide to one side, her jaw grotesquely misaligned, her eyes at different heights. Another child, a boy, had limbs that bent at wrong angles, his arms too short. His legs bowed so severely that his knees nearly touched. The third child appeared blind, with clouded eyes that reflected no light, and when he moved, he did so with the jerking motions of a broken puppet. Dr. Weiss, a veteran of rural medicine who had delivered hundreds of babies and treated every injury and illness imaginable, felt his professional composure shatter. He had never seen such a concentration of birth defects in one place. These were not random misfortunes. These were the unmistakable signs of severe genetic damage, the kind that occurred when bloodlines became tangled and turned back on themselves. Margaret Crowder sat in a rocking chair near the fire, her eyes closed, rocking continuously, murmuring words no one could understand. She was 49 years old. She looked 70. Her hands, resting in her lap, trembled constantly. Sheriff Rayburn asked to speak with Thomas Crowder. Silas gestured with his stick toward the back of the house. They found him in what might have been a bedroom, though it contained only a straw mattress on the floor and a few wooden crates. Thomas was with his sister Mary. They were sitting close together, too close, and when the door opened, they sprang apart with the guilty reflex of criminals caught in an act. Mary Crowder, now 27, was expecting another child. Her abdomen was swollen beneath a filthy dress. She had 2 teeth left in her mouth. Her hair hung in greasy strings. Her arms were covered with bruises in various stages of healing, purple, green, yellow, painting a timeline of pain on her skin. The interview that followed, documented in Sheriff Rayburn's official report filed on April 18, 1947, and stored in the Harlan County Courthouse until 1983 when it was discovered during a renovation, revealed a horror that defied comprehension. Thomas Crowder admitted, with no apparent shame or understanding of wrongdoing, that all the children in the house were his. The mothers were his sisters, Mary, Elizabeth, Sarah, and Ruth. He stated this as simple fact, the way another man might describe his occupation or the weather. When asked why, he seemed confused by the question. They lived here. They were his family. This was how things were. Elizabeth, he said, had died 2 months earlier during childbirth. The baby, another girl with a head shaped like an egg and no ability to swallow, had died within days. They buried them both up on the ridge in the family plot. No one had reported the deaths. No one outside the family had known. Sarah was in one of the back cabins, he told them, with her 2 surviving children. Ruth was in another cabin. She no longer came to the main house, he explained. She couldn't walk well anymore, and her mind had gone somewhere else. She spent her days talking to people who weren't there. Dr. Weiss examined the children, all 7 of them that remained alive. His medical notes, preserved in the county archives, read like a catalog of genetic catastrophe: hydrocephalus, microcephaly, club feet, cleft palates so severe the children could barely eat, seizure disorders, profound intellectual disabilities, blindness, deafness, spinal deformities, heart murmurs indicating structural abnormalities, skin conditions that left raw, weeping sores across their small bodies. Not one of the children appeared to have the cognitive ability beyond that of an infant, despite ages ranging from 2 to 5 years. Not one could speak. Not one could walk normally. Not one would survive, in Dr. Weiss's professional opinion, beyond childhood. The damage was too extensive, too fundamental. The most disturbing discovery came in the back cabin where Sarah lived. She was 23 years old, but her body had been destroyed by repeated pregnancies and births. Dr. Weiss counted evidence of at least 6 pregnancies and the physical trauma visible on examination. She told them in a voice so soft they had to strain to hear that she had given birth to 8 babies. 4 had died during delivery. 2 more died within weeks. Only 2 had survived past infancy, and they were the blind boy and the girl with the misaligned face currently in the main house. The arrests came swiftly. Thomas Crowder was charged with multiple violations of Kentucky law concerning carnal knowledge of family members, a crime that carried severe penalties even in 1947. Silas and Margaret were charged as accessories, for knowing what was happening and taking no action to stop it or seek help. The trial began in November 1947 in the Harlan County Courthouse, a red brick building in the center of Harlan, Kentucky. The courtroom was packed every day with spectators who had traveled from surrounding counties to witness what newspapers were calling the trial of the Mountain Monster. The prosecution, led by District Attorney James Caldwell, presented evidence methodically and without sensationalism, though the facts themselves were sensational enough. He brought in Dr. Weiss, who testified about the children's conditions and what caused them. He explained in terms that the 1947 jury could understand how marriage between close blood relatives produced offspring with dramatically increased chances of inheriting recessive genetic conditions. When both parents carried the same damaged genes, their children would express those damages physically and mentally. He used charts showing the Crowder family tree, how it didn't branch but instead folded back on itself, creating loops where there should have been separate lines. He explained that while one generation of close breeding might produce relatively normal children, each subsequent generation compounded the damage exponentially. By the 3rd generation, with Thomas's fathering children with his own sisters, the genetic destruction was catastrophic and irreversible. The defense attorney, a young lawyer named Patrick Sullivan, who had been assigned the case because no one else would take it, had little to work with. He attempted to argue that Thomas Crowder was himself a victim of isolation and ignorance, that growing up in the remote hollow with no education, no exposure to society's norms, and no understanding of genetics or morality, he simply didn't know his actions were wrong. The jury of 12 men, all farmers and workers from Harlan County, deliberated for 4 hours. They found Thomas Crowder guilty on all counts. The judge, Henry Morrison, sentenced him to 25 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville. Silas and Margaret Crowder received 5 years each. Though Margaret would die in prison after 18 months, her mind completely gone, her body finally giving out. But the trial raised questions that haunted the community for decades. How had this happened? How had an entire family descended into such darkness without anyone stopping it? The answer lay in the geography and sociology of Appalachia in the early 20th century. The mountains created natural isolation. Families lived miles apart, connected by rough trails, often unable to travel in winter months. There was no electricity, no telephones, no roads in many areas until the 1950s. A family could disappear into a hollow and be forgotten by the outside world. Privacy was sacred. What happened on a man's property was his business, and mountain culture strongly resisted outside interference. Add to this the poverty, the lack of education, the prevalence of illiteracy, and the suspicion of authorities that characterized the region. People kept to themselves. They handled their own problems. They didn't talk to outsiders about family matters. The Crowder case shattered that isolation. Newspapers across Kentucky covered the trial. The Louisville Courier-Journal ran a front-page story with the headline, "Mountain Family's Dark Secret Revealed." National attention followed, with reporters from as far as New York traveling to Harlan to cover the story. At this moment, I want you to pause and think about something. Think about Sarah Crowder, 23 years old. Her body broken by 8 pregnancies, her children dying one after another. Each one more damaged than the last, trapped in that cabin with no escape, no hope, no future. Think about what that does to a human soul. Now leave a comment with these exact words. Some prisons have no walls. Say it. Because until you acknowledge that horror, you can't understand what really happened on that mountain. The surviving children became wards of the state of Kentucky in December 1947. All 7 were removed from the Crowder property and placed in the Central Kentucky Institution for the Feeble-Minded in Frankfort, a facility that served as both hospital and asylum for those deemed mentally incompetent. The institution's records, unsealed in 1995, provide a detailed account of their short, tragic lives. None of the children were adoptable. Their medical needs were too extensive, their disabilities too severe. They required constant care, feeding tubes in some cases, medications for seizures, treatment for infections that plagued their compromised immune systems. The oldest, a boy named Samuel by the staff since his actual name was unknown, died in March 1948, 5 months after admission. He was approximately 5 years old. The cause of death was recorded as pneumonia, but his underlying conditions, including a severely malformed heart and lungs, meant he had no capacity to fight even a mild infection. By 1950, 4 more of the Crowder children had died. Complications from their genetic conditions proved insurmountable. Mid-century medicine, even with the best intentions, could not undo the fundamental biological damage they had inherited. The 2 longest survivors were the blind boy, called John by the staff, and a girl named Helen, who had the ability to make sounds, though not speak. John lived until 1953, dying at approximately 8 years old from a combination of seizures and organ failure. Helen survived until 1955, making her the last of the Crowder children. She was approximately 10 years old when she died of heart failure, her damaged body finally giving out. None of the children ever spoke a word. None walked independently. None showed any awareness of themselves as individuals or understanding of the world around them. They existed in a twilight state between life and death. Biological organisms kept alive by medical care, but never truly living in any meaningful sense. The institution's administrator, Dr. George Blackburn, wrote in his annual report for 1955, "The Crowder children represent the most severe case of genetic damage from consanguinity that this institution has ever encountered. Their brief lives serve as a stark warning about the consequences when human breeding violates the natural law of genetic diversity. Science has shown us that blood must mix with blood from outside the family line, or else it turns toxic, producing offspring whose suffering serves no purpose except to demonstrate nature's intolerance of such violations." Meanwhile, back in Harlan County, the Crowder property stood abandoned. Local people avoided it, calling it cursed. The cabins gradually collapsed under the weight of snow and rain. The main house sagged further each year, its porch falling away, its roof caving in. Nature reclaimed the land, vines and young trees growing up through the floors, animals nesting in the ruins. Mary, Sarah, and Ruth Crowder, the surviving sisters, were placed in the custody of a distant cousin in Virginia. None of them ever recovered psychologically from their experiences. Ruth died in 1951 at age 25, the official cause listed as heart failure, though those who knew her said she had simply lost the will to live and faded away like smoke. Sarah lived until 1968, spending her final years in a psychiatric facility, never speaking about her past. Mary survived the longest, dying in 1979 at age 59. She never married, never had a normal life, carried the trauma of those mountain years like a weight that bent her spine and crushed her spirit. Thomas Crowder served 18 years of his sentence before dying in prison in 1965 at age 47. His death certificate listed the cause as liver failure, but prison records indicate he had been declining for years, his body breaking down prematurely, likely from the same genetic issues that had plagued his children. Some researchers later speculated that Thomas himself was the product of close breeding, that the Crowder family's practice of intermarriage went back further than anyone knew, and that Thomas's own abnormal behavior and lack of moral understanding might have been symptoms of his own damaged inheritance. Silas Crowder was released from prison in 1952 after serving his full sentence. He returned to Harlan County, but not to the family property. He lived in a boarding house in the town of Lynch, working odd jobs until his death in 1957. He never spoke publicly about what had happened. The few people who knew him in those final years described him as a broken man who spent his evenings sitting on the boarding house porch, staring at the mountains, saying nothing to anyone. The Crowder case became a turning point in how Kentucky and other Appalachian states addressed isolated communities and potential illegal practices occurring beyond the reach of law enforcement. In 1948, the Kentucky State Legislature passed new laws requiring regular welfare checks on children in remote areas, establishing a system of county health visitors who would travel to isolated homesteads to ensure children were receiving basic care and education. The case also contributed to growing scientific understanding of genetics and the dangers of consanguinity. While the basic principles of heredity were understood by 1947, the Crowder children provided a real-world demonstration of genetic damage that researchers studied for decades. Medical papers published in the 1950s referenced the case, though names were changed for privacy, to illustrate the catastrophic results of multiple generations of extremely close inbreeding. Dr. Harold Weiss, the physician who first examined the Crowder children, became an advocate for rural health care reform. He spent the rest of his career, until his retirement in 1970, pushing for better medical access in remote mountain communities. He gave lectures at medical schools throughout Kentucky, using the Crowder case as an example of what happens when poverty, isolation, and ignorance combine to create conditions where preventable tragedies occur. He died in 1981 at age 78, still haunted by the faces of those damaged children. The physical evidence of the Crowder family gradually disappeared. The property was eventually sold for unpaid taxes in 1963. A logging company bought it, harvested the marketable timber, and abandoned it again. By the 1970s, no structures remained standing. The family cemetery, with its unmarked graves, was overgrown and lost. Hikers who occasionally pass through the area report finding old foundation stones and rusted metal, but nothing that would indicate the horror that once existed there. The psychological and social impact on Harlan County took longer to fade. For years after the trial, the Crowder name was spoken in whispers, if at all. Families in isolated areas faced increased scrutiny and suspicion. The case fed into stereotypes about Appalachian people that persist to this day, unfairly painting an entire region with the brush of one family's grotesque behavior. But beyond the stereotypes and the sensationalism, the Crowder case reveals fundamental truths about human nature and the consequences of isolation. It demonstrates how quickly civilization's thin veneer can crack when people are removed from society's moderating influence. It shows how ignorance, poverty, and geographic isolation can create conditions where moral boundaries collapse and the most basic taboos are violated. The scientific lesson is equally clear. Human beings require genetic diversity to produce healthy offspring. When bloodlines become too concentrated, when the same genes circle back on themselves generation after generation, the result is biological catastrophe. The recessive genes that normally hide in the population, suppressed by dominant healthy genes from outside the family, become expressed when both parents carry them. The children pay the price, born into bodies that cannot function, minds that cannot develop, lives that are nothing but suffering. The 7 Crowder children who died in the Central Kentucky institution had no choice in their existence. They didn't ask to be born into damaged bodies. They didn't deserve the pain and confusion that filled their short lives. They were innocent victims of their parents' actions and their grandparents' failure to intervene. Their grave markers at the institution's cemetery, simple stones with just first names and years, stand as monuments to the darkest corners of human behavior. In 1983, a graduate student from the University of Kentucky named Rebecca Hartman was researching Appalachian social history when she discovered Sheriff Rayburn's original report in the courthouse archives. Her dissertation, Isolation and Incest, the Crowder family case and its implications for rural community health, brought the case back to public attention. She interviewed elderly residents who remembered the trial, tracked down distant relatives, and pieced together a comprehensive history of the family. Hartman's research revealed that the Crowder family's isolation was not entirely accidental. Silas's grandfather, who had established the homestead in 1867, had moved to the remote hollow specifically to escape civilization after being accused, though never convicted, of a similar offense in Virginia. The family had a history, buried and denied, of keeping to themselves and maintaining bloodlines that should have been allowed to mix with those of outsiders. The pattern had repeated across generations, each time moving deeper into the mountains, further from society, until it reached its horrific culmination in Thomas Crowder's crimes. Today, the location of the former Crowder property is known only to a few local historians and researchers. There's no historical marker, no memorial, nothing to indicate what happened there. The mountains have reclaimed the land completely, trees grow tall where the cabins once stood. Wildlife flourishes in the absence of human occupation. Nature has healed the physical scars, but the story remains preserved in court documents, medical records, and the fading memories of those old enough to remember when the news broke about the family in the hollow. The man who loved his sisters, and the children whose bodies paid the price for sins they never committed. The Crowder case stands as a warning across time. It reminds us that isolation breeds darkness, that secrets fester and grow toxic, and that the violation of nature's laws carries consequences measured in human suffering. The children born on that mountain died decades ago, but they're brief. Painful existences continue to teach us about the boundaries that must not be crossed, and the price humanity pays when blood turns back upon itself and becomes poison.